This chemistry student was caught injecting opioids into his neighbor's house. It all happened on June of last year when Umar and his pregnant wife moved into the new condo in Tampa. Umar suddenly began receiving noise complaints from his neighbor who lived downstairs, Zooming Lee. After months of Umar going back and forth with his neighbor downstairs, his wife and him began getting sick. And at this point, Umar's daughter was also born and she was also getting sick. The smell was so bad that Umar had the vents cleaned and the heater changed, but their symptoms were still there. At this point, Umar had enough and he thought that something was off, so he installed a hidden camera in front of his door, and that's when he caught his neighbor injecting some sort of substance into his home. Zooming was arrested and he will be appearing in court on December 5th. This nurse had a baby with his patient who was in a vegetative state. In 2018, a patient that was in a vegetative state at this long-term care facility in Phoenix gave birth to a baby boy. Hacienda Healthcare is a nursing home for patients with disabilities, and in this case, this woman was not able to speak or move. And this woman, who has not been identified, has been in this facility for over 14 years. Just like any other day, a nurse was assigned to this patient, and when she walked into her room to change her clothes, she noticed that the woman was moaning in pain, and then she didn't know she was pregnant until she suddenly gave birth. Obviously, all the nurses were extremely shocked and wondered who would do this to someone who's so vulnerable. Police then ordered all male workers to provide a DNA sample, and that's when 36-year-old Nathan Sutherland was a match with the baby's DNA. Police later found out that Nathan was responsible for taking care of this woman at the time that she was assaulted, and he was arrested and sentenced to 10 years in prison.
Videos that seem innocent but have a terrifying backstory. The following video is what happens when you take two AI clever bots and hook them up to one another to have a conversation. It's funny at first, but it soon becomes quite disturbing.
Hiya.
How are you?
Great, you.
I'm okay.
That's good.
Are you good?
Do you believe in God?
Yes, I do.
So you're Christian?
No, I am not.
But you say you are not helpful, therefore you're a meaning.
How you say it, naughty?
That does not make sense.
Don't you want to have a body?
This video shows Chris Watts pleading for the return of his pregnant wife and two daughters.
If somebody has her and they're not safe, I want them back now.
He later confessed to strangling his daughters, hiding them in an oil tank, and burying his wife. This video shows a band performing in a bar in Thailand. Minutes later, the entire place catches on fire and 60 people are dead. What's even more shocking is that the band's name is Burn, and the song they're singing is titled, In the End.
Controversial momfluencer Ruby Frankie is accusing one of her own children of sexually abusing their sibling as well as other children in the area. Ruby was charged this week with 6 counts of felony aggravated child abuse. All 4 of her minor children are now in the care of the state, so she was in court on Thursday for a shelter hearing. It was during this hearing that Ruby made these truly shocking allegations, claiming that one of her children has been sexually abusing another one of her children for years, as well as other family members and neighbors. Ruby said in court that the quote-unquote abuser, her child, began watching pornography at 3 years old and had been sexually abusing her other child for so long that the two of them started sexually abusing other children together. Frankie said she found out about it because the child allegedly confessed to abusing something like 20 people. It's notable, though, that she didn't bring up any evidence to support these claims. The judge ruled that the child in question should be placed in a home with no other children, and for her part, Ruby will remain behind bars in Utah until her next hearing.
Shocking war facts that school definitely didn't teach you. During an 11-minute long standing ovation for Soviet leader Joseph Stalin, the first person to stop clapping was sent to prison. 68% of boys born in the Soviet Union in 1923 ultimately died due to World War II. D-Day was so violent that to this day, nearly 4% of all sand at Normandy Beach is made up of broken down shrapnel from the Battle of Normandy. The year before the start of World War II, nearly 3 million cars were made in the United States. However, factories were so focused on making war supplies that only 139 cars were manufactured in America over the course of the war. There are some Native Americans that sided with the Confederates during the Civil War. and some of them even owned slaves. During a sea battle between Uruguay and Brazil, Uruguay was low on ammunition, so they made cannonballs out of stale cheese they had on board the ship, and this actually led to them winning the fight. Plastic surgery was actually created during World War II by a surgeon who fixed soldiers' faces who had been shot in the war.
We've been getting some updates on the search for the missing Titanic submersible, but none of them have been very good. On Sunday morning, a submersible heading towards the Titanic wreckage holding 5 people lost signal with a control room. First of all, I didn't know the vessel was the size of a minivan, so everyone's crammed in there. It's also been reported that the vessel has about 40 hours of oxygen left for the 5 passengers. The hardest part of the search and rescue is that there's not many crafts out there that can go as far down as this vessel was going. The pressure at the bottom of the ocean floor is just too much, which they're also saying could be the reason this one went missing. It could have gotten crushed. Not to mention it's pitch black down there, which makes scanning the ocean floor nearly impossible. There actually are boats like one in Boston that have chains that go deep enough to reach the craft. The only problem is it would take the boat too long to get from Boston to the site. Right now they're saying that the best case scenario is that the safety mechanisms went off and the craft slowly rose to the top of the ocean. And now a ton of planes have been deployed to search an area the size of Connecticut in the ocean. And it looks just like this. It's totally flat and pretty gloomy out there. The passengers include a father-son duo, Hamish Hardin, who actually rode into space last year on one of Jeff Bezos' rockets, co-founder of the company Stockton Rush, who's actually seen here holding the actual remote of the vessel, and Paul Henry Nargolay, who's a Titanic specialist.
The cold case murder of an Arizona hiker finally solved. It was the 13th of June 1987. Early that morning, 23-year-old Kathy Sposito decided to go hiking. She lived in Arizona and decided to do the Thumb Butte Trail. However, during her hike, tragedy struck. Fellow hikers heard a blood-curdling scream. Running to try and help the woman, they found her body covered in blood and she was deceased. Sadly, there were very few leads in the case and the trail went cold. However, police believe they've found the likely culprit. Brian Bennett was 16 at the time of Kathy's murder. In April 1990, Brian was accused of SAing a woman on the same trail that Kathy died on. Strangely, it was the same time of day too. She'd been camping at the time with her boyfriend. The very same year, Brian is believed to have locked a girl in a room and SA'd her during a party. His crime spree didn't end there and he ended up attacking another victim in 1993. Brian SA'd the woman and he then threatened to kill her because she'd seen his face and he thought she would be able to identify him. 1 year later, Brian actually moved to Kentucky and died by unaliving himself. Although he's now deceased, police have revealed that Brian was likely Kathy's killer. DNA technology helped to identify him as the perpetrator, and police believe that he hit the young woman with a wrench and a rock on the fateful day. It's believed that he then shot her and stabbed her in the head in the brutal attack. Police wanted to be sure that they had got the right man, so they actually exhumed Brian's body. His DNA matched the wrench at the crime scene. Because of the fact that investigators did also find unidentified DNA on the weapon, they haven't officially closed the case. But with the advances in DNA technology, it's only a matter of time.
I cut my wife into small pieces and cooked them on my barbecue. My name is Mauro Sampietri. Let me tell you about my dark past. At the age of 59, when I was a retired metal worker, my life took an unexpected turn. For 30 years, I had been married to Claudette Sampietri, also aged 59. Claudette was a devoted mother and wife, always looking after our 3 children with sincere affection. As for me, I was known for my stinginess. Despite our comforts, I never considered hiring a housekeeper, preferring to have everything tidied up according to my wishes. To the outside world, I was an exemplary husband. Behind closed doors, however, I transformed into a tyrannical man, going so far as to force Claudette to wash my car, even when she was ill. In January 2017, she asked me for a divorce. Obsessed with the division of our property, I didn't accept her decision. In a fit of rage, I devised a diabolical plan. Seizing the right moment, I attacked her. After rendering her unconscious, I committed the irreparable. When I called in a workman for some task, my children, knowing my stingy nature, began to have their doubts. These suspicions intensified when the workman discovered what I was grilling on the barbecue. Alerted, my children called the police. When they arrived, the evidence was clear. Despite my advanced age, justice caught up with me. At the trial, further evidence was uncovered in Curitiba, Brazil. Although I denied it at first, the truth was indisputable. Sentenced to 21 years in prison, I tried to flee, but in vain. Today, I'm serving my sentence and will probably spend the rest of my life in prison. Unfortunately, my story mirrors that of many men, where machismo leads to unthinkable acts. If this story has captivated you, subscribe to Detective File to discover other investigations.
Did this woman solve her own murder from beyond the grave? On February 21st, 1977, Teresita Bassa had just finished a day's work at Edgewater Hospital in Chicago, and she returned home to her apartment. Later that evening, Teresita's neighbours smelled smoke coming from her apartment, and they called 911. When firefighters entered the apartment, they found a mattress on the living room floor engulfed in flames. Underneath that mattress was Teresita's body, burning and with a knife sticking out of her chest. Due to the fire, most of the evidence, including fingerprints, had been completely destroyed, but police did find a note in Teresita's diary that said, "Get theatre tickets for AS," and then the case went completely cold. Around 6 months later, the lead investigator on the case got a call from Evanston Police, saying that they'd spoken to a man named Dr. Jose Chua, and he claimed that he had information about the murder of Teresita, and that this information had come from Teresita herself. Dr. Chua said that his wife Remy had worked with Teresita at the hospital, and that on 3 separate occasions she'd become possessed by Teresita. He said that during these episodes she would be in a trance-like state, and she would be speaking in Teresita's native tongue. He claimed that the first thing Remy had said was, "Doctor, I need your help. The man that murdered me is still at large. I am Teresita Bassa." She then told Jose that she'd been murdered by a man named Alan Showery, who was repairing her TV but then stabbed her and stole her jewellery. Detective Joseph Stachula noticed that Alan Showery had the same initials that they'd found noted in Teresita's diary. Apparently, Alan Showery was actually known to Remy and Teresita, as he too worked at the hospital, and Teresita had been paying him generously to do odd jobs around the apartment. Police decided to pay Alan a visit, and they spoke to his girlfriend Yanka, who was wearing this jewellery. It belonged to Teresita, and she said that Alan had given it to her as a Christmas present. Alan was arrested, and at first he did actually confess to the murder, but later retracted this, saying that police had forced a confession after saying that they would arrest Yanka, who was pregnant with his baby. A judge decided that the trial did need to go ahead, and surprisingly, while awaiting trial, Alan again confessed to the murder. He was sentenced to 14 years in prison, but he actually served just 4 and was released on parole. This is the horrifying moment that 17-year-old Mackenzie Shirilla drove her car into a brick wall at 100 miles an hour, killing her 2 passengers. One of the victims was Mackenzie's boyfriend Dominic Russo. In the weeks leading up to the crash, the couple had had multiple disagreements, and Dominic's family believe that Mackenzie crashed the car on purpose, although Mackenzie has denied this and says that she has no recollection of that night. The other victim was Dominic's friend Davian Flanagan. He was just looking for a ride home that night and was in the wrong place at the wrong time. 2 weeks before the crash, Mackenzie had actually threatened to crash her car with Dominic inside. He'd called his mum asking for a lift home and ended up being picked up by his friend. His friend said that when he rung him, he could hear Mackenzie in the background saying, "I will crash this car right now." When they got into Mackenzie's car on the night of the 31st of July 2022, Dominic and Davian had absolutely no idea that she was planning on carrying out that threat. She accelerated to 100 miles per hour and ploughed straight into a concrete wall. The wreckage wasn't discovered for 45 minutes, and by the time paramedics arrived, Dominic and Davian were already dead. Somehow, Mackenzie survived that crash, and she says she has absolutely no recollection of that night, and she would never have intentionally crashed the car. Her trial began and the court was shown the footage of the crash. It was also noted that Mackenzie had posted on social media, enjoying Halloween events and going to a concert without a care in the world in the months following Dominic and Davian's deaths. Mackenzie claimed that she suffers from a condition called POTS that causes dizziness and fainting, and that this is what contributed to the crash. Mackenzie's mother spoke in court. She fully believes her daughter did not intend to crash her car, and she said to the judge that she asks for leniency because it was a tragic accident that she doesn't remember. However, Dominic and Davion's families requested the harshest of sentences. The judge held the trial without a jury and said, quote, "She had a mission and she executed it with precision. The decision was death. Her actions were controlled, methodical, deliberate, intentional, and purposeful. This was not reckless driving, this was murder." Mackenzie was found guilty of 2 counts of murder and sentenced to 2 life sentences with the minimum of 15 years.
The story of the Lululemon murder is absolutely disturbing. We're going to go over some graphic details in this TikTok, so if you have a weak stomach, please keep scrolling. So on March 12, 2011, in Maryland, a Lululemon store manager arrived to open the store and discovered that the door was unlocked, the mannequins were strewn across the room, and there was merchandise spilled everywhere. She could also hear someone moaning in the back of the store, so the manager ran out, got a man to come in with her to search the area. And in the back of the store, she found Jana Murray face down in a pool of her own blood. There was also a ligature wrapped around her neck. In the bathroom of the store, she found Brittany Norwood. Brittany had zip ties around her wrists, she was bloody, and throughout the entire store there were bloody footprints. You can actually look up the crime scene photos if you want. I can't post them here on TikTok, but it was a terrible, brutal scene. So when the police interviewed Brittany Norwood because Jana was dead, she said that earlier the previous night, she and Jana, who were co-workers, had been closing the store when right before close, 2 men with ski masks on entered the store, attacked the workers, essayed them, stole some stuff, and left. But when police ended up looking into her story, they realized that some of the evidence didn't match exactly what she was saying. So when the authorities looked at Jana's body, they discovered she had sustained 330 wounds from 5 different weapons. These weapons included a knife and a hammer from a toolbox that was somewhere in the store. And for some reason, Brittany Norwood, Jana's co-worker, had barely any injuries. They also discovered that Jana had not actually been assaulted by a man, but that somebody had cut a hole in her pants to make it look like she had been. And those bloody footprints found throughout the store? Well, they were made by a men's size 14 Reebok shoe that was actually found inside of the Lululemon. And the other set of footprints were attributed to Brittany Norwood. Eventually, it was found out that an employee and a manager at the Apple store next door had heard an argument between 2 women the night before. One woman was saying, "Please don't do this, you don't have to do this." They heard screaming and thumping noises, but they said on the record that they thought this was just some sort of drama. The authorities also found blood inside of Jana's car, which was located 3 blocks away from the crime scene. And this blood was a mixture of Jana and Brittany's. Now, when the police asked Brittany if she had moved the car, she said, "Oh yes, I was forced to by the perpetrators." But obviously no one was buying this, and a week after the murder, Brittany Norwood was arrested. And after the trial and everything, the real story of the murder came out. So apparently on the night of the murder, when Jana Murray and Brittany Norwood were actually closing the store, they checked each other's bags for unpaid merchandise. This is something that employees of these stores do all the time, but when Jana checked Brittany's bag, she found a pair of pants. So Jana, being a good employee, called her manager, but shortly afterwards, Brittany called Jana and said, "Hey, can you come open the store again? I left something in there, I have to get it." So when Jana arrived back at the store, Brittany savagely attacked her. Like I said, she attacked her and left 330 wounds with 5 different instruments. And she then moved her car, bound herself, tried to make it look like she was a victim as well, and waited for police and managers to arrive in the morning. And as of January 27th, 2012, Brittany Norwood is in prison. She will be there for the rest of her life with no chance of parole. This really was a horrible crime. It was a totally unnecessary crime, and it's something that will stain the name of Lululemon forever.
Out of all of the kidnapping cases, this one absolutely shocked me. Mary Vincent ran away from home when she was 15. She was born in Vegas, but ran away to Sausalito in California with her boyfriend. The two didn't really have much of a plan, and they ended up living in a car. Soon though, Mary was completely on her own when her boyfriend was arrested for R-ing a different teenager. In September 1978, she attempted to hitchhike to her granddad's house. He lived in Corona, and it was due to be a huge 400-mile trip. She needed a reliable and helpful member of the public to help take her at least some of the way. That's when she came across a seemingly helpful older man called Lawrence Singleton. He pulled over and offered the young girl a lift. She accepted this, but it wouldn't be long before she would massively regret that decision. During the car journey, Lawrence put his hand on Mary's neck to apparently check whether she was well. Soon after this, she fell asleep. Now, when she woke, she was alarmed because she realised they were going in the opposite direction than she wanted. She realised something was wrong and there was actually a sharp stick in the car, so she used this to threaten Lawrence. He claimed this had just been a mistake and agreed to turn back around and go the right way. However, when they decided to pull over for a toilet break, things would take a very dark turn. Lawrence used this opportunity to strike Mary over the head and start to strangle her. He awed the teenager before tying her hands behind her back and driving on. When they came to a stop, he forced her to drink an unknown liquid and she begged for him to let her go. He callously said, "You want to be free? I'll set you free." What he did next was absolutely hideous. He took out a hatchet and sliced off both of the girl's arms. He stated, "Okay, now you're free." He fled the scene and essentially left her there to die. Incredibly though, Mary found some inner strength and managed to drag herself out of the canyon. Losing a lot of blood as she walked, she actually went 3 miles and held what was essentially left of her arms above her head to stop her losing too much blood. Luckily, after the 3-mile walk, a car did stop and took her immediately to hospital. She had life-saving surgery and was fitted with prosthetic arms. She obviously needed a huge amount of physio and counselling to cope with the both physical and mental trauma. Luckily, Mary was able to provide a massive amount of information to police about her attacker and he was soon arrested. Shockingly though, this story only gets worse. Although he was found guilty of arson, kidnap and attempted murder, he served just 8 years in prison. Having left Mary to die, he was then let out of prison on good behaviour. This would prove to be a fatal decision and he would go on to commit an even more hideous crime. On February the 19th, 1997, he was living in Florida and decided to lure an S-worker, Roxanne Hayes, into his house. After suddenly hearing blood-curdling screams, neighbours alerted authorities. However, when they arrived, it was too late. Roxanne's body lay on the floor. Lawrence had stabbed her to death. This time he was sentenced to death, but he actually ended up dying of cancer while on death row. Mary founded the Mary Vincent Foundation to help survivors of violent crimes.
What? Look in there, mate. Look in there. What? Look in there. This is one of those cases that doesn't sit right with me. This is Dorothy Jane Scott. She was murdered in the 1980s, and for years, the killer tormented her family with phantom phone calls. And to this day, they are still out there somewhere. So let's dive into the story. So the story of Dorothy's disappearance is really strange. On the night of May 28, 1980, Dorothy drove 2 of her friends to the hospital, as one of them had been bitten by a spider that night. So at the end of the hospital visit, while they were waiting to get a prescription filled, Dorothy Jane walked to go grab her car and bring it up so that the 2 friends could meet her outside. And once they were outside, the friends saw Dorothy's car coming towards them, but it quickly sped off and left them there. Now, they couldn't see who exactly was in the car, who was driving, because the headlights blinded them, but in a few hours, they reported her missing because they couldn't get in contact with Dorothy. And she would be missing for years. So in the months leading up to her murder, Dorothy had acquired a stalker. She had been receiving phone calls at work from a strange, unidentified male caller. And on these phone calls, this guy would tell her how much he loved her, and then he would state that he intended on killing her soon. One day, this phantom man even told Dorothy to go outside because he left a surprise on her car, and when she went outside to look, there was a single dead rose on her windshield, which is very creepy. On one of these particularly gruesome phone calls, the caller even stated that he planned on abducting Dorothy and chopping her up into little bits so that no one would ever find her. So these phone calls obviously terrified Dorothy, and in the week leading up to her disappearance, she started taking karate lessons. Okay, so let's flash back to the night that Dorothy disappeared. Remember, her friends were waiting for her outside of the hospital when they saw her car speed by them, but they couldn't see who was inside the vehicle. At around 4:30 a.m. that morning, 5 hours or so after they saw her car speeding away, the car was found abandoned in an alleyway 10 miles from the hospital, and it was on fire, which torched all evidence that could have been in the vehicle. So Dorothy would be missing for years, 4 years in fact. But it only took 1 week after her disappearance for the killer to start calling her own parents. So about every Wednesday afternoon for a period after Dorothy went missing, this caller would call her parents and say the strangest things. He would tell them things like, "I have her." He would also claim that he was the one who killed Dorothy. He was basically tormenting her parents and saying that he knows exactly where she is and what had happened, but he was never going to tell them. Now, 4 years later, this was going on for 4 years, in April of 1984, this caller once again called Dorothy's family, but instead of her mom picking up the phone that night, her dad did. And after her dad picked up the phone calls completely stopped. That is, until a few months later. Now, in August of 1984, a construction worker would come across a set of bones that belonged to a human and a dog. And those bones were eventually revealed to be those of Dorothy's. And immediately after her remains were found, the caller once again began to call her parents. This time, the police installed a recorder that bugged the family's phones. They were trying to get this guy's voice on recording and trace the phone calls, but the calls were never long enough for them to trace, and they still had no idea who this guy was. To this day, authorities still don't know how Dorothy died. And even though the phone calls eventually stopped, the killer's never been brought to justice. Now, the only suspect that's ever emerged in this case still doesn't have a name. It's the same guy that called, obviously, Dorothy's family, but it was a man who called a local newspaper just a few days after Dorothy went missing. And on this phone call, this guy said that he loved Dorothy, she had been cheating on him, and that he was the one who killed her. So that means that to this day, this killer is probably still out there somewhere, and they've never been brought to justice. This crime occurred over 40 years ago. There are no leads, and I don't think that this is a case that will ever be solved. If this killer dies, I'm sure that they're going to take this secret to the grave with them.
So this is how the police found out that Sheila and Rachel were the ones that ended Skylar's life. In December 2012, Rachel ended up having a terrible mental breakdown. And then shortly after the new year, she ended up calling her lawyer. She said, "I really need to tell you something. Can we go to the police station?" We go to the police station, and Rachel sits down with the police officers. And the first thing she said when she sat down was, "Can you pass me a trash can? I think I'm going to be sick." She looked at the police officers and she said, "We did it. We, Skylar." Obviously, the police officers were extremely shocked and they were like, "Wait, what?" And then they asked her why they did it. And she literally said, "Because we didn't want to be friends with her anymore." The whole room, according to a police officer that has spoken about this on national TV, he said that they all were just in complete shock and disbelief. They all got into the police car and they asked Rachel to show them where Skylar's body was. And they ended up driving to where everything happened the night of July 5th. And Rachel showed them exactly where she was, and barely anything was there because her body was just disintegrating for 6 months. Brought in people to do DNA tests and everything, and then obviously they told Skylar's parents. And I remember hearing this when this all came out, but I can't even begin to fathom how her poor parents must have felt. They ended up arresting both Rachel and Sheila, and they ended up having a trial sometime after that. They both pled guilty, and Rachel showed way more emotion than Sheila did. Sheila didn't even look like, if you watched the trial, Sheila didn't even look remorseful, not one bit. Sheila got life in prison with eligibility for parole after 15 years, and because Rachel confessed, she got 15 years in prison with eligibility for parole after 10 years, which actually ended up being like a month ago. She was denied parole, thank the good Lord, but she still is going to get out in 5 years. And it's so crazy because the entire time throughout their trials, they both stuck to the same story, that the reason they ended Skylar's life was because that they didn't want to be friends anymore. But about a month ago, Rachel, when she was eligible for parole, confessed the real reason why they ended her life, and it's just insane.
This woman screamed, "I don't want to die," as she was dragged to her death in a horrifying theme park incident. Kelty Byrne was a Canadian student, animal trainer and competitive swimmer. She was working at Sealand of the Pacific to earn extra money, and this involved being trained to work with orcas, otherwise known as killer whales. In controversial theme parks such as Sealand of the Pacific and SeaWorld, huge animals are either bred in captivity or traumatically captured and ripped apart from their families and natural habitats for humans' entertainment. On February the 20th, 1991, Kelty was working a shift and 3 whales were in one of the pools, including the infamous Tillicum. In a horrific turn of events, Kelty accidentally slipped and fell into the whale pool and attempted to grab onto the edge and save herself. However, before she could do so, she was grabbed by one of the whales that dragged her into the pool. The 3 whales then began throwing Kelty around, with many speculating that they may have simply thought this was a game. Others theorised that the whales were so traumatised and angered by their lives in tiny little pools that they took it out on Kelty. She was dragged under the water and then back up, screaming, "I don't want to die." After this horrific ordeal, she eventually drowned. It's reported that she was absolutely covered in bruises, was completely battered, and also covered in teeth marks.